The call came just after midnight, slicing through the quiet of Sergeant Sam Harper's apartment like a whisper carried on wine through a graveyard. He didn't need to check the screen. The moment the ringtone, his private line from Arlington, broke the silence, he was already out of bed, already standing at attention in his mind. In the dark, his figure was tall and lean, built from years of discipline, and his silhouette against the window was as still as the sentries he watched over at the tomb of the unknown soldier. His brown skin, calloused hands, and stoic eyes had weathered more than most ever would. He answered the call with a voice already formal, already braced. "Harper." The voice on the other end was clipped, military, respectful. It only needed to say 3 words, "It's Danny Walsh." Sam didn't speak, didn't breathe. He listened as the caller continued, each word punching holes in his chest. "Private First Class Daniel Walsh, killed in action, classified mission, Middle East, immediate return stateside. Escort assignment, granted to Sergeant Samuel Harper by personal request on file." The words blurred after that. Sam stood in the middle of the room, phone still pressed to his ear long after the voice had gone. Outside, Washington's streetlights cast golden shadows on the pavement, but inside, everything was frozen. Danny Walsh. Dead. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Sam reached for the drawer where he kept the photo, that one battered print from their first deployment. 2 kids in sandblasted fatigues, one white, one black, arms slung around each other under a desert moon, grinning like fools who thought war couldn't touch them. They were wrong. War touched everything. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo. Danny's face beamed out of the grainy paper, that lopsided smile like he'd just cracked a joke Sam was too serious to get. Danny had always been the heart, the fire, the reckless courage. Sam had been the compass, the steady one, the one counting steps while Danny leapt into action. They were opposites who had become brothers, bloodless but bound. They'd met in basic, clashed immediately. Sam was all rules and regulation, Danny was instinct and heart. But Afghanistan burned all that away. Somewhere between fire missions and midnight watches, they found rhythm. Found brotherhood. And now he was gone. Sam pressed the photo against his forehead, eyes closed. He remembered the last time they spoke. The last night before that mission. Danny had been quiet, too quiet. They sat on overturned ammo crates outside the barracks, desert wind kicking up dust devils in the moonlight. Danny had leaned back, helmet off, eyes on the stars. "If I don't make it back," he said softly, "don't you dare sneak me through some loading dock." Sam had looked over, brows raised. Danny met his gaze, dead serious. "Main concourse. Full honors. No shortcuts. You promise me that, Sam. You make them see." Sam had nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The weight of the promise settled on his shoulders that night and had never lifted. Now it pressed down like armor. Sam rose from the bed and began preparing in silence. He shaved with precision, his movements deliberate. He laid out his uniform with care. The black coat with scarlet piping, the white gloves, the belt, the badge of the tomb guard that gleamed like a sacred relic. Each item was more than cloth and brass. It was ritual. It was reverence. And today, it was personal. By 04:30, Sam stood outside the base chapel, the morning still dark around him. A transport van waited to take him to the airport where Danny's body would arrive. He didn't blink as the van pulled up, didn't hesitate as he stepped inside. The driver, a young airman, looked back in the rearview mirror and said nothing. He didn't need to. Sam's presence filled the silence. At Ronald Reagan National Airport, the air was already buzzing with early travelers, rolling luggage and rushing announcements, neon screens blinking like nervous heartbeats. Somewhere among them, Maggie Walsh and her granddaughter Emma were making their way to the terminal, clutching hope and grief in trembling hands. But Sam hadn't seen them yet. His focus was fixed on the tarmac, on the exact place where the casket would arrive. He stood ramrod straight, boots polished to a mirror shine, body still as marble, eyes locked forward. He was a monument of mourning. An airline official approached him, trying to offer an alternate entrance for the procession once the casket was received. "It's quicker, Sergeant," the man said, holding a clipboard like a shield. Sam didn't answer. He turned his head slowly, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "We'll take the main terminal, as arranged." The man hesitated, opened his mouth, thought better of it, and walked away. The sun broke the horizon slowly, its light creeping along the tarmac like reverence come alive. A cargo plane's engines roared in the distance. Sam's heart thudded like a drumbeat of memory. He didn't move. His mind played back every moment with Danny, the time he shielded Sam during an ambush, the dumb jokes, the endless debates about music, football, the meaning of courage. He remembered Danny's laugh under the stars. He remembered the fear in his voice that last night. And most of all, he remembered the promise. The aircraft touched down with a screech of wheels and a billow of steam. The door hissed open. A ramp descended. The honor guard began to move, slow and synchronized. And then came the casket. Draped in the flag, gleaming in the morning sun, it was more than wood and steel. It was a symbol. A body wrapped in memory and sacrifice. Sam took his position beside it, hands white-gloved and still. As the casket rolled past the gate, the crowd began to shift. Some paused. Some lowered their phones. Others simply watched in silence. They didn't know the story. They didn't need to. The weight of it moved through the air like a hymn. Sam's fingers twitched slightly, a reflex reaching for the photograph folded in his pocket. His hand stopped. This wasn't about holding on. This was about letting the world see what it meant to keep a promise. Not in secret. Not in silence. But in full view of the living. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Back when the war still felt like something distant and abstract, Sam Harper met Danny Walsh on a sunbaked training field in Georgia. It was the kind of heat that wrapped around you like a vice, squeezing the strength out of your muscles and leaving only grit behind. Sam had been one of the first to arrive at basic, already squared away, boots laced sharp, uniform pressed, every motion precise. Danny showed up late, sunglasses still on, laughing as if he'd wandered onto a baseball field instead of into a war machine. Sam remembered watching him from across the barracks, thinking, he's going to get someone hurt. But what surprised him wasn't the recklessness, it was the heart behind it. Danny had a way of pulling people in, even those like Sam who had built walls taller than themselves just to survive. Sam didn't talk much back then. He didn't smile either. He carried himself with a kind of quiet authority, the kind born not of pride but of burden. He was used to being the only black man in the room who took everything twice as seriously just to be seen as equal. He'd grown up in Baltimore, raised by a grandmother who had known hard times and expected nothing less than excellence. She taught him to keep his shoes clean and his promises cleaner. The army gave him purpose, but that woman gave him discipline. Danny was chaos with a grin. He cracked jokes during roll call, hummed Springsteen while scrubbing the latrines, and called Sam Sarge before he ever earned the rank. "You're the type they build statues of," Danny once said, flopping onto the bunk beside him. "I'm the guy in the background cracking a beer open." Sam didn't respond, just kept polishing his boots. "You think too much," Danny added, nudging him with an elbow. "Yeah," Sam replied finally, not looking up, "because I like staying alive." Their rivalry turned into camaraderie the way thunderstorms turn into sunlight, unexpectedly, but with purpose. It started on the obstacle course. Sam was leading his unit across the rope bridge when Danny slipped, losing his grip on a wet rung. Sam didn't hesitate. He spun around, grabbed Danny's wrist with both hands, and hauled him up with a grunt that echoed off the trees. Danny stared at him, stunned. "You saved my ass," he said, panting. "You owe me one," Sam replied. "So don't screw it up next time." From then on, they were inseparable. Not just because they had each other's backs, but because they balanced one another. Danny taught Sam to laugh again, to loosen his grip on life just a little. Sam taught Danny how to aim straighter, think quicker, be sharper. They trained together, deployed together, survived together. In Afghanistan, the rules changed. The line between bravery and stupidity blurred daily. The nights were long and loud, filled with distant explosions and the low thrum of helicopters slicing the sky. In those nights, when sleep felt like a myth and fear crawled into your bones, Sam and Danny would sit outside their bunker, sharing smuggled candy and old stories. Danny talked about home a lot, about Maggie, the single mom who raised him on nurses' wages, about little Emma, who sent him crayon drawings of tanks with hearts on them. About baseball and flying and how someday he wanted to see the Grand Canyon in person. Sam didn't talk much about his own family. His grandmother had passed just before his first deployment. He didn't have siblings, no wife, no kids. But Danny filled that gap like sunlight spilling into a dark room. Then came their second tour, and things got real. One night, their unit was ambushed while patrolling a ridge. Bullets ripped through the air like angry whispers. Sam was moving into cover when he heard Danny's voice shout, "On your left." Then a body slammed into his, knocking him to the ground just as gunfire stitched the air where his head had been. It was Danny. Sam remembered the searing pain in his shoulder, the dust choking his lungs, and Danny's voice yelling, "Don't get sentimental on me, Sarge. You're still prettier than me." The medics patched them up, and Danny brushed it off like it was a joke, but something changed after that. There was a heaviness in his laugh, a tiredness in his eyes. He started talking more seriously about life after the war, about wanting to get out, go back to school, maybe fly commercial jets. Sam knew what that meant. Danny was scared. They both were. But neither said it aloud. On their third deployment, something in Danny settled. He stopped rushing into danger first. He listened more. And one night, under a moon so full it looked like it could burst, he turned to Sam and said, "You're my compass, man. I charge in, but you keep me pointed the right way." Sam didn't reply. He didn't have to. The words etched themselves into his soul. Then came the mission that changed everything. Classified. Off the books. Something about hostages. Sam wasn't part of it, he was reassigned for logistics. Danny was chosen because he was fast, reliable, and fearless. He'd left without much fanfare, just a slap on the back and a wink. "When I get back, I want barbecue. You owe me that." But Danny didn't come back. All Sam got was a folded letter, a directive, and a silent scream that never left his throat. Now, standing at the airport with the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders, Sam remembered every moment. Every laugh. Every bullet. Every promise. And in the pocket over his heart, the photograph they took together, two young men caught in a sliver of peace between war, waited like a heartbeat. Sam wasn't just escorting a body today. He was walking for both of them. And nothing, no protocol, no airport manager, no obstacle in the world, was going to stop him from doing it right. For Danny. For the brother he didn't get to save. For the promise made beneath foreign stars that now lit a fire in his soul. The night before the mission that would take Danny's life, the desert was still. The wind, usually restless and cutting, had gone quiet as if the land itself sensed something coming. The sky stretched wide above the outpost, littered with stars so bright they felt almost intrusive, exposing every fear and memory the soldiers tried to bury in the daylight. Sam Harper sat alone at the edge of the compound, his rifle across his knees, boots dug into the sand. He stared at the stars not for guidance but for escape, his dark skin glowing slightly in the moonlight, his jaw tight with thoughts he never spoke aloud. He wasn't one to dwell, but something about that night pressed in on him like a warning wrapped in silence. Behind him, the barracks buzzed with the soft murmur of tired soldiers, but out here, it was just him and the sand. Danny appeared like he always did, loud in motion but soft in presence. He dropped down beside Sam without a word, unwrapping a piece of hard candy and tossing it into his mouth before offering one. Sam took it, more out of habit than desire, and let the sweetness linger on his tongue. For a long moment, neither said anything. They didn't need to. The weight of war hung between them, heavy but familiar, like an old scar that only throbbed when the weather changed. "You ever think about home?" Danny finally asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Sam gave a small nod. "Sometimes. I think about it a lot lately," Danny continued. "About Maggie and Emma. About how Ma always made meatloaf on Thursdays, even though I hated it. About the way Emma used to fall asleep holding my dog tags like they were magic." He chuckled, but there was a crack in his voice. "I miss stupid stuff, man. Baseball games. Traffic. Even that busted fridge back home that always made the same noise as an incoming drone." Sam didn't laugh. He just listened. "You know what scares me?" Danny asked suddenly, turning to face him. "It's not dying. I mean, yeah, it sucks, but I signed up knowing it might happen. What scares me is disappearing. Being one of those guys who comes home in a box and nobody remembers. They just wheel you in through some back corridor like you're cargo, not someone who lived and fought and mattered." "You're not cargo," Sam said quietly, his voice a steady drumbeat. "Not to me." Danny nodded, eyes glistening just enough for the stars to catch the shine. "That's why I need you to promise me something." Sam turned to him fully, his posture still but his gaze sharp. "Go on." "If I don't come back," Danny said, his voice suddenly hard and serious, "I want you to bring me home. Not just anywhere, through the main concourse. In full uniform. Let them see. Let them stop and watch and know that someone gave a damn. I don't want to be a secret. I don't want my family walking through some employee gate because my body might delay a flight. I want honor, Sam. You hear me? I want them to remember." Sam felt the words settle deep, as if they weren't spoken but branded into his chest. He could hear the sincerity behind the request, the urgency, the deep human ache to be seen, to be valued even in death. Danny was asking for more than a gesture. He was asking for a legacy. "You have my word," Sam said. "If the worst happens, I'll bring you home with full honors. No shortcuts. No shadows." Danny relaxed slightly, leaning back on his elbows. "You're the only one I trust to do it right." They sat there until the stars began to fade. When the call came just before dawn, Danny stood without hesitation. He gave Sam a look that said more than any goodbye. A mix of brotherhood and resignation, of pride and fear. Sam didn't stop him. He just rose to attention and offered a crisp salute. Danny returned it with a smirk. "Save some of that ceremony for later, Sarge." Then he was gone. Sam never saw him again. The next day, the base went quiet in a different way. The kind of silence that follows tragedy. No one talked about the mission. The details were classified, the outcome obvious. 3 soldiers didn't return. Among them, Private First Class Daniel Walsh. When the commanding officer handed Sam the official orders to escort the remains, his hands shook. It wasn't just grief, it was the crushing weight of a promise now made real. He stared at the sealed envelope, the name written in neat black ink, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Later that night, Sam took the same seat outside the barracks where he and Danny had talked. He held the photograph in his hands, creased and faded, their faces side by side, smiling as if death was a thing that only happened to other people. The stars were out again, scattered like witnesses. And Sam made the promise again, this time to the wind. He would not let Danny be forgotten. Now, standing at the edge of a crowded airport terminal with the sun breaking through the glass, that same promise pulsed inside Sam's chest like a living thing. He was not just here to escort a body. He was here to make the world look, to force it to slow down and acknowledge a life that ended in sacrifice. Danny's name deserved to echo through the walls, through the silence, through the hearts of strangers. The uniform Sam wore was pristine. His posture flawless. But it was the fire in his eyes that drew attention, the unspoken declaration that this moment mattered. That some things were bigger than schedules or gate changes. That a soldier's journey home should never be hidden. As the transport plane approached, Sam's grip tightened slightly, not from fear but from conviction. He had walked alongside Danny in life. Now he would walk beside him in death. Through the noise, through the tension, through the center of a world too busy to remember, until it had no choice but to stop and see. And when they did, they would understand. This wasn't just an escort. It was a promise kept under desert stars. The envelope lay unopened on Sam Harper's bunk for nearly 2 hours. It was military issue, creased at the edges, stamped with official clearance markings, and bore the weight of something final. Sam didn't need to tear it open to know what it said. He'd felt it the moment he walked into the commanding officer's office that morning, the tightness in the room, the way the sergeant major's eyes shifted away from his, and how the silence came first, heavier than any sentence. He'd been summoned with 3 other men, but only Sam had been asked to stay after the others left. That's when he knew. And yet, when he finally picked up the envelope, his fingers were gentle, reverent, as if even the act of touching it too quickly might break something sacred inside. The room around him was dim, lit only by the afternoon sun bleeding through half-closed blinds. His gear was stacked neatly in the corner, his rifle polished and resting against the wall, everything in order except the storm brewing behind his composed face. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the envelope balanced on his knee like a letter from a ghost. He stared at it until the printed name began to blur. Private First Class Daniel Walsh. He blinked once, then tore it open. PFC Walsh, Daniel R., Kia. Classified engagement. Casualty transport to begin immediately. Sergeant Harper, S., assigned as primary escort. Request for full military honors granted. Escort mission approved per pre-deployment directive. Sam read the words again, each line a blow he refused to flinch from. It was official now. Not just the death. The duty. The burden that had been whispered beneath desert stars had become an order backed by the full weight of the United States Army. Danny's final wish was now Sam's mission. And there would be no deviation, no shortcuts, no compromise. He folded the document slowly, carefully, and placed it into the breast pocket of his Class A uniform. Then he stood, his shoulders squaring against the ache that threatened to unmake him. There was no time to grieve in the way civilians did, no collapsing, no screaming at the sky. He had been trained for composure. Conditioned to control. But inside, something was splintering. Not just from loss, but from memory. Danny had been more than a fellow soldier. He had been the only person who ever got past Sam's armor. The only one who made him laugh without feeling like he'd betrayed something. And now he was gone. A life that burned so brightly extinguished in silence and sand. Sam moved with mechanical precision as he prepared. His uniform had already been laid out, pressed the night before, polished to inspection standards. The black jacket with its scarlet trim, the belt perfectly centered, the Tomb Guard badge shining like a medal of faith. He dressed like a man entering a sacred space, not a terminal. Every button fastened was a word in a vow. Every fold of cloth, a reminder of duty. When he reached for his gloves, he hesitated. His hands were steady, but his breath caught as he slid the white cotton over his fingers. These gloves would touch the flag. These gloves would cradle Danny's final journey. He caught his reflection in the mirror and stood still for a moment. What stared back at him wasn't just a soldier, it was a symbol. A sentinel. A man sworn to silence and honor, now carrying the weight of a brother's sacrifice. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the bright collar, and for a moment, he thought about his grandmother, about how proud she would have been to see him now, standing in full uniform not for parade but for truth. She used to say, "You show people how to treat you by how you carry yourself." He carried himself now like a promise incarnate. The door opened with a knock, and a young lieutenant stepped in. He looked flustered, papers in hand, eyes darting nervously. "Sergeant Harper, the vehicle is ready to take you to the airstrip. The casket will arrive in 2 hours. You'll accompany it to Washington. The family's already been notified." Sam gave a tight nod. "Understood." The lieutenant shifted. "They asked for you by name." "The mother said Danny talked about you a lot." Sam didn't speak. He couldn't. He just picked up his cover and placed it neatly under his arm. He followed the lieutenant out of the building without another word. The sun outside was harsh, the heat clinging to his skin, but he barely felt it. The world around him was moving, but he moved through it as if underwater, each step deliberate, each breath measured. At the airstrip, the plane waited. It was a dull gray C-17, its engines idling with a slow rumble, like the heartbeat of something ancient. A detail of honor guard members stood ready near the rear ramp, their uniforms as sharp as his own. The casket had not yet arrived, but its place had been prepared. The area was cordoned off, and even the mechanics nearby moved with quiet respect. Sam stepped closer to the loading bay and paused. He looked out over the airfield, the flat stretch of tarmac gleaming under the afternoon sun. He thought about Danny's laugh echoing in the mess hall. About the stupid jokes. About the quiet fears they never voiced aloud. About the desert stars and the night Danny made him promise something no soldier should ever have to consider. That if death came, he wouldn't be hidden. He'd be seen. He felt a presence beside him and turned slightly. A chaplain stood there, silent, offering nothing but company. Sam didn't need prayers right now. He needed resolve. But still, he nodded once, grateful for the gesture. The chaplain reached into his coat and handed Sam a small, sealed envelope. "From his sister," he said softly. She wanted it placed with him before the final flight. Sam accepted it with care and tucked it into his jacket. He knew the moment was drawing near. The escort was more than ceremony. It was a declaration. That this man, Daniel Walsh, was not just another casualty. He was a brother. A protector. A light. And he would not be silenced in death. The air shifted as a transport vehicle rolled in from the horizon, a slow-moving silhouette growing larger. The casket was coming. Sam squared his shoulders. The promise was beginning. Margaret Walsh stood just outside the airport terminal doors, her hands clenched tightly around the handle of a rolling suitcase she hadn't wanted to pack. At 70 years old, Maggie's posture was still strong, her spine upright from years of standing through 12-hour nursing shifts in military hospitals. Her once red hair had faded to silver, pulled into a tight bun that framed a face lined with both strength and sorrow. The wind pushed gently against her long black coat as if trying to move her forward, but Maggie didn't budge. Not yet. Not until she was ready. And she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready to say goodbye to her only son. Beside her, 10-year-old Emma clutched a stuffed bear with one hand and her grandmother's coat with the other. Her blonde hair was messy from sleep, her eyes wide and confused beneath lashes too heavy for someone her age. She didn't speak, but her silence carried questions that pierced deeper than any words. She looked up at Maggie, tugging lightly at her sleeve. "Grandma," she whispered, "is that Danny's plane?" Maggie turned her eyes toward the tarmac, where the silhouette of a large transport aircraft loomed in the distance, its gray wings stretching against the pale morning sky. Her throat tightened as if the grief had risen like a tide and lodged itself behind her voice. She nodded slowly, unable to force words past the weight in her chest. She squeezed Emma's hand and offered a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Danny had left for deployment a year ago with that same bear tucked into his duffel bag, promising Emma he'd bring it back filled with stories. Maggie remembered the day he enlisted. He was 19, impulsive, and full of heart. "I want to serve like you did, Mom," he said. "But I want to make it back." Maggie had tried to stay neutral, had tried to support his decision as she'd supported thousands of others during her years as a military nurse. But when it's your own child stepping into war, neutrality becomes a mask you wear over your fear. And now here she was, holding the hand of a little girl who would never get to hear those stories. She took a deep breath and forced herself to walk forward. The automatic doors of the terminal slid open, and the cool air inside hit her face like a second wave of loss. People moved quickly in all directions, families hurrying to gates, business travelers sipping coffee, children dragging backpacks behind them. It was just another day for everyone else. But not for Maggie. Not for Emma. Not for the man lying in a flag-draped casket on that plane outside. They found their way to the designated waiting area where military escorts had told them to go. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a small sign read, "Family Escort, Private First Class Walsh." Maggie stared at the name on the sign for several seconds, her breath catching as the reality sank deeper. Her son was now a name on a sign. A designation. A case file. A timetable to be managed and cleared. Her stomach churned. She sat down with Emma on her lap and wrapped her arms around the child. Emma leaned into her without a word, the bear pressed between them. Maggie stroked her granddaughter's hair, her fingers trembling. "Your uncle was brave," she finally said. "He helped people. He made sure his friends came home." Emma looked up at her, blinking slowly. "But he didn't come home." "No," Maggie said, her voice shaking. "But we're here to make sure he does now. The right way." As they waited, Maggie thought back to the last video call with Danny. It had been glitchy, the connection cutting in and out, but his face had lit up the screen all the same. He had smiled that crooked smile and told Emma he loved her more than jelly beans and jet planes. Then he'd turned serious, just for a moment, and told Maggie something that had stayed with her. "If something happens, I've got it covered," he'd said. "I've got someone watching my six." She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Now, with a name like a prayer repeating in her mind, Sergeant Samuel Harper. She finally did. Danny had trusted someone to carry him home. Not just physically, but with honor. A voice came over the intercom, crisp and official. "Family of Private First Class Daniel Walsh, please prepare to proceed to the receiving gate. Escort will arrive shortly." Maggie stood, smoothing her coat and gently lifting Emma to her feet. She looked out through the large terminal windows where the military casket was now being unloaded with deliberate reverence. Standing beside it, tall and unmoving, was a man in a sharp uniform, black and scarlet, white gloves glowing against the morning sun. Even at this distance, Maggie could feel the gravity that radiated from him. He didn't fidget, didn't flinch. He simply stood, watchful, respectful, resolved. She knew, without being told, that this was the man Danny had trusted. "Is that him?" Emma asked softly. "Yes," Maggie replied. "That's Sergeant Harper. He's the one bringing Danny home." Emma reached into her small bag and pulled out something crumpled and colorful. It was one of the last drawings she had sent to her uncle, a stick figure of Danny in a soldier's helmet, standing next to a big heart. She had drawn herself, too, smiling under the sun. She held it up to Maggie. "Do you think he remembers this?" "I know he does," Maggie said, kneeling to look her in the eyes. And when the time comes, we'll make sure it's with him. They approached the edge of the terminal gate where a pair of soldiers stood at attention. One of them nodded and stepped aside as the door to the tarmac opened. Maggie caught her breath as the casket came into full view. The flag was perfect, every fold sharp and deliberate. And beside it, Sergeant Harper moved with grace and purpose, walking in tandem with the pallbearers like he was part of the very ceremony of grief itself. He turned his head briefly and met Maggie's eyes. In that fleeting moment, something passed between them, not words, not even recognition, but a deep acknowledgement. He saw her. She saw him. And between them was the memory of a young man who once laughed beneath desert stars and now lay beneath the red, white, and blue. Maggie straightened her back, holding Emma's hand tighter. She didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later. For now, she walked toward her son with all the strength she had left. Inside the glass-paneled office that overlooked the main terminal floor of the airport, James Thornton stood with a tablet in one hand and a mug of lukewarm coffee in the other, watching the flight display board flicker with arrival and departure updates. The morning rush had begun, and passengers poured through security lines like water down a funnel. He liked this part of the day. Predictable. Timed. Controlled. He took pride in his record, a 98% on-time departure rate, no small feat at one of the busiest airports on the eastern seaboard. Efficiency was his gospel. Precision his identity. And nothing, absolutely nothing, disrupted his operations without consequence. So when Sarah, his young assistant, knocked softly and stepped inside with a slightly pale face and a clipboard pressed to her chest, he already sensed something was wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, hesitated, then cleared her throat. "There's a military escort scheduled for today's 11:20 arrival from Al Udeid," she said. "Full honors. Main concourse procession." James's brow furrowed. "Main concourse," he repeated sharply. "Not through the private corridor." "Approved by the director herself, sir," Sarah said carefully. "Apparently, it's a personal escort, family requested. A tomb guard." James turned away from the screen slowly, setting down his coffee with deliberate precision. "And no one thought to notify me?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "The paperwork was filed, but it got routed through security instead of ops. The name is Sergeant Samuel Harper." James tapped his fingers against the desk. "A military procession during peak traffic hours. Do they understand what that does to our gate flow? We have 19 departures between 10:45 and 12:15. That's the window we rely on to clear midday congestion." "Sir," Sarah offered gently, "it's not just any escort. This one seems special." James narrowed his eyes. "There are back corridors for a reason. If every soldier got a parade, no one would make their flights." Sarah swallowed her protest. She knew better than to push too hard. James Thornton had built his reputation on logistics, not compassion. He turned to the window and looked down at the terminal floor. The honor guard was just now beginning to form at the edge of the concourse, visible through the massive glass panes like statues coming to life. And there, unmistakably centered in crisp uniform, stood Sergeant Harper. Even from this distance, James could feel the command in the man's presence. There was something immovable about him, something that said this was not just a job, it was something closer to sacred. Still, James wasn't about to allow sentiment to disrupt order. He grabbed his radio. "Get me the director," he snapped. "Until I hear otherwise, we're rerouting this through the secure passageways. We'll make the announcement formal in 5. Sarah hesitated. "Sir. I think we should wait. If the director signed off." "She can unsign it," James cut in. "We don't grind a major airport to a halt for ceremony. This isn't Arlington. This is an international transit hub. We keep people moving." Across the terminal, Sam Harper watched the distant movement of staff members converging. He saw the body language. The hurried walks. The exchanged glances. He knew what was happening before they even spoke a word. He didn't need a radio to feel resistance forming. It had happened before. It always did. Logistics was the language of bureaucracy, and honor didn't always translate. A junior officer approached him, clipboard in hand. "Sergeant Harper," the young man said, nervousness bubbling under his attempt at authority, "operations is requesting a route change. Service corridors. Less traffic. More privacy." Sam looked at him, unmoving. "And who authorized this request?" "Manager Thornton," the officer replied. "He says it's for operational efficiency." Sam's voice was low, even, but each syllable struck with precision. "Private First Class Daniel Walsh is not cargo. He is not a parcel to be delivered in secret. He will pass through the main terminal. With honor. As arranged." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. Sam turned away and returned to his position beside the casket. His eyes didn't shift again. Back in the operations office, James was pacing now, reading numbers from a digital screen. "If we reroute this procession, we reduce pedestrian crossflow by 30%, he muttered. "No backup at TSA. No traffic jam at gate C-17. It's common sense." Sarah stepped forward cautiously. "But it's not just about flow, sir. People are already watching. There's a crowd forming. Veterans, families, kids. Some are crying. It's turning into something more than a delay." James spun toward her. "Then we end it before it grows. Make an announcement. Tell them it's a safety issue. We'll frame it as protecting the dignity of the deceased." Sarah didn't move. "Sir, he was a decorated soldier. The man bringing him home is a tomb guard. There's a line we might not want to cross here." James stared at her. "And I'm telling you that I'm not letting one soldier's story shut down this airport." Outside the glass, the casket had now been lowered from the aircraft and placed on the ceremonial cart. Sam took his place beside it. He stood like he belonged in another century, a man carved from principle. Travelers paused, unsure what was happening but instinctively sensing the gravity of the moment. A child tugged on her mother's coat and pointed. A businessman closed his laptop. Even the barista behind the coffee kiosk stopped frothing milk and watched with quiet awe. But above them all, James Thornton still saw only delays. Numbers. Timetables. Percentages. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Security to hold the procession at Gate A2, he ordered. Escort is to be redirected through service tunnels." He didn't see what was coming next. He didn't see the way the ground itself seemed to still under Sam's feet. He didn't hear the wave of quiet that swept across the terminal as travelers began to realize they were witnessing something rare. Something sacred. Something they didn't quite understand but knew not to interrupt. James didn't see that, in the eyes of hundreds of strangers, the moment was no longer about convenience. It was about reverence. And Sergeant Sam Harper wasn't about to let that be forgotten. The terminal lights glowed overhead, casting a soft gleam across the polished tile floor as Sergeant Sam Harper stood motionless beside the casket of Private First Class Daniel Walsh. His white gloves, crisp uniform, and unreadable expression drew quiet respect from onlookers, even if they didn't fully understand the ceremony unfolding before them. The flag draped over the casket caught the light just right, its stars and stripes bold and immaculate, as if defying anyone who might forget the sacrifice beneath it. People slowed. Some stopped completely. Phones lowered. Conversations fell silent. Sam could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way reverence had crept into the air like a rising tide. But he could also feel something else, a storm brewing, subtle at first, but growing with every step Manager James Thornton took as he approached with determined urgency and that same cursed clipboard in hand. "Sergeant," Thornton said as he arrived, his voice hushed but edged with command. "We've prepared an alternative route. It's more efficient. Fewer disruptions." Sam didn't turn. His eyes stayed locked on the casket, his voice level and deliberate. "This route has been approved by the airport director. The family has requested full honors. We will proceed as planned." Thornton's mouth tightened. "I understand that you're following military protocol, Sergeant, but this is a civilian facility. We're trying to avoid chaos. There's a service corridor with direct access to the loading zone. We can maintain dignity without causing a spectacle." Sam slowly turned his head, just enough to meet Thornton's eyes. "Dignity is not found in shadows," he said. "Honor is not something to be concealed for convenience." Thornton stepped closer, lowering his voice, though his frustration simmered just beneath the surface. "Look, I respect what this soldier did. I really do. But we have thousands of travelers moving through here. We can't stop the airport for one person." "You don't stop the airport," Sam said. "You pause it. For one moment. For one man who gave everything. And that's not just for him. That's for every person watching who needs to be reminded what sacrifice looks like." Thornton exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "You don't run this terminal, Sergeant. I do. And I have protocols that supersede emotional pageantry. This is about logistics, not legacy." Sam's eyes didn't flinch. "No. This is about a promise." That word struck something in the air between them, something Thornton didn't understand but couldn't ignore. A promise. Sam thought of the desert, of Danny's quiet voice asking not to be forgotten, of the stars overhead and the absolute certainty in that request. He hadn't made the promise as a courtesy. He had made it as a soldier. As a brother. And now he was standing on sacred ground, not of religion, but of remembrance, and he would not be moved. Thornton tapped his clipboard against his hand. "Sergeant, if you continue to resist, I will be forced to involve security. This isn't defiance. It's obstruction." Sam took a single step toward him, his stature unwavering. "Then call them. But understand this, I will not be the one dishonoring a fallen soldier. You will." A murmur passed through the gathering crowd. More passengers had stopped to observe. Veterans in ball caps. Children clutching their parents' hands. Airport staff. Flight attendants. All watching, listening, sensing that something deeper than an escort was unfolding here. The line between routine and reverence had been crossed, and no one, except Thornton, seemed willing to turn back. Sarah, Thornton's assistant, appeared at the edge of the confrontation, her face pale with tension. "Sir," she said cautiously, "the crowd's growing. People are filming. We're trending already on local feeds. Maybe we should wait for the director." Thornton silenced her with a look. "We're not going to let this get out of hand." He stepped forward, raising his hand slightly, gesturing toward the casket. "Let's just guide it this way. We'll preserve the moment, I promise." Sam's hand moved swiftly, not with force, but with unwavering clarity, intercepting Thornton's motion before it reached the flag. He grasped the man's wrist, his grip firm and composed. "Don't touch the flag," he said quietly, but the words echoed louder than any shout could have. Time seemed to pause. For a split second, Thornton's face registered genuine surprise, then offense. "Are you serious?" Sam released his wrist with the same control he had used to stop it. "Dead serious. That flag isn't yours to move. It's not a prop. It's not fabric. It's a soldier's shroud. And only those who have earned the right may lay a hand on it." The silence was complete now. No announcements, no chatter, no steps across tile. Just the stillness that comes when people recognize something sacred in their midst. Thornton looked around and finally saw what Sam already knew, that he'd lost the room. That every eye was on him not in support, but in judgment. And that judgment was justified. Sam turned back toward the casket, his eyes forward once more, his back straight, and his hands resting at his sides. He had not raised his voice, had not disrespected authority, but he had drawn a line. A moral perimeter. One that no clipboard, no manager, no protocol could override. Thornton stood in place, uncertain, unsteady. He looked down at his clipboard as if it could offer him guidance, but the numbers meant nothing now. The schedule had no weight against the silence that had fallen over the terminal. A child asked his mother, "Why is he standing like that?" "To show respect," she whispered. "Because that man loved someone enough to carry him home." Sam didn't hear her, but maybe, in some way, he did. He felt the shift around him. Not just compliance. Understanding. A recognition that something solemn had rooted itself here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Not while he stood guard. And he would keep standing. Because this wasn't about traffic. It was about a promise, made in the dust of a distant land, under stars older than war, spoken between two brothers whose bond would not be buried with the body in that casket. Not while one of them still had breath left to defend it. The moment Sergeant Sam Harper uttered those 5 words, the air inside the terminal thickened as if time itself had paused to bear witness. "Don't touch the flag." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. His voice was calm, almost reverent, but it carried the weight of 1,000 funerals, 1,000 folded triangles handed to weeping mothers. James Thornton stood frozen, his hand suspended in mid-air just inches from the casket, the silence around them swelling like a wave holding its breath before crashing. The tension crackled, not with noise, but with meaning. Around them, the crowd watched, some with confusion, some with awe, some with tears already welling. Travelers who just moments ago were concerned with delays and gate changes now found themselves rooted to the floor, as if tethered by the gravity of a moment too sacred to turn away from. Thornton's hand trembled as he slowly pulled it back, his face shifting from indignation to something closer to embarrassment. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected the entire terminal to turn into an audience. And he definitely hadn't expected to be called out so publicly by a man who stood with the steadiness of a granite monument. "Sergeant," Thornton began, voice tighter now, the edge of authority dimmed by a hint of unease, "I understand your passion, but I'm still in charge of this facility. I'm trying to find a solution that respects everyone's time." Sam interrupted without raising his tone. "Time is not what this moment asks for. It asks for respect. And respect doesn't come with shortcuts." Thornton stepped back, lowering his hand, but his pride flared as he motioned to security staff nearby. "Escort him off if he continues to interfere with operations." One of the guards moved toward them but slowed when he got close enough to see the casket, the gleam of the Tomb Guard badge on Sam's chest, and the look in his eyes. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was duty. Pure and unshakable. The guard hesitated, glancing at Thornton, then at the crowd. Then he stepped aside. Across the concourse, someone lowered their bag and stepped forward. An older man, back slightly hunched but still dignified in posture, wore a battered USMC cap from the Vietnam era. He approached with a limp born from a wound long ago and stood just a few feet away from Sam. "I served," the man said, voice raspy but clear. "Lost brothers who never came home. Some who did, came through a loading dock with nobody watching. Nobody knowing their names. That soldier deserves better." Thornton's jaw clenched. "This isn't about disrespect. It's about logistics. I'm trying to maintain order." The veteran didn't blink. "You can't maintain order by stripping honor. That's not order. That's control." A ripple of approval spread through the crowd. More phones were lowered. A mother wiped her eyes. A businessman who had been glancing at his watch now looked straight ahead, no longer thinking about his next meeting. Something had shifted permanently in the terminal. This wasn't a delay anymore. It was a procession. Maggie Walsh stood quietly with her arm around Emma, her eyes locked on Sam. She'd been watching everything. The standoff. The words. The quiet courage. Sam hadn't looked in her direction yet, but she knew, somehow, she knew, that everything Danny had told her about this man was true. He was a man of integrity, not show. A man who didn't need to explain what honor meant, because he lived it. She stepped forward now, Emma's small hand in hers, and walked up beside Sam. Her voice was soft but firm. "That's my son," she said, addressing Thornton without blinking. "He's in that casket. He loved this country. He believed in what he was doing. And he died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. All he asked, his only request, was that he come home through the front door. Like he mattered." Emma clutched a crayon drawing in her other hand, folded and wrinkled from travel. She looked up at the casket and whispered, "Uncle Danny's home now." Thornton's expression faltered, and for the first time, his shoulders sagged. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. Around them, the terminal remained utterly still. Even the loudspeaker announcement seemed to have gone silent. It was as if the building itself understood it had become a sanctuary, if only for this moment. Sam looked down at Emma and finally offered the smallest nod. Then he turned back to Thornton one last time. "This isn't a spectacle," he said. "It's a farewell. And you don't rush a farewell. Not for the man who saved lives. Not for the girl who drew him stars. Not for a mother who waited at the window every night. We're not asking permission. We're honoring a promise." Thornton swallowed hard and stepped back. He nodded once, but said nothing. The clipboard in his hand now felt like a shield made of paper, useless and weak against the wall of silence and dignity that had risen before him. He turned and walked away. Sam stood still, eyes forward. The casket, the flag, the crowd, everything in its place. He didn't need applause. He didn't need thanks. All he needed was this hallway, these people, this moment. The procession would begin soon. The march would be slow, deliberate, heavy with meaning. But for now, in the quiet before the steps began, Sam let his breath settle and felt the invisible weight on his shoulders shift just slightly. He had drawn the line. And the world had finally stopped to see it. The moment James Thornton retreated, the air seemed to lighten, only slightly, like a held breath slowly released, but it was enough. Enough to allow the murmurs of the crowd to return, hushed and reverent, like voices inside a cathedral. Sam Harper didn't move. He stood sentinel beside the flag-draped casket, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed ahead, but not unfocused. He saw everything. Every person who had stopped walking. Every mother who instinctively pulled her child closer. Every airline employee who had stepped from behind a counter to stand in silent tribute. It was happening just as Danny had hoped. Not with a fanfare, but with presence. With honor. From the crowd, someone stepped forward again, slow and deliberate, his steps marked by a dragging foot that echoed faintly against the terminal's polished floor. He was old, thin and wiry in build but carried himself like a man who once knew command. The brim of his faded cap read "Vietnam Veteran" in fraying gold thread. His jacket bore a single patch of the Marine Corps, and his eyes, clouded by age but clear in intent, never left Sam. When he stopped just a few feet away, the silence around him grew. People instinctively shifted to make room, giving him space without being asked. He stood facing Sam and the casket, removed his cap, and held it against his heart. "Name's George Miller," he said, his voice cracked but strong. "3rd Battalion, Khe San. I lost 17 men before I made it out." Sam acknowledged him with the barest of nods. George continued. "I remember coming home," he said, his voice louder now, reaching through the hush. "Wasn't like this. No one stopped. No one saluted. Hell, some folks looked away like I'd brought something back with me they didn't want to catch. Took off my uniform before I even got off the bus. The crowd around them grew stiller, listening, leaning in. Sam felt something flicker in the man's voice. Not bitterness. Memory. I carried my best friend's helmet halfway across the world, George said, his eyes now shining. Man died next to me in a foxhole. We promised each other, whoever lived, he'd take the other home. But the world didn't let me. I brought his things, but they flew his body in at night. Through a back gate. Like he was luggage. He looked directly at Thornton, who had stopped several paces away, standing uncertain and quiet, his arms folded and jaw set. I've spent decades wishing I'd done something different, George said. Wishing I'd stood up, like this man did. He turned back to Sam and gestured toward the casket. You're doing it right, Sergeant. You're giving this boy what too many of us never got. Sam didn't speak. He didn't have to. The power in George's words was already rippling outward. More veterans in the crowd began stepping forward. An older woman in an Air Force bomber jacket placed her hand over her chest. A man in a wheelchair reached into his lap and unfolded an American flag no larger than a postcard. He held it in trembling fingers, his mouth pressed into a straight line as his eyes locked on the casket. It wasn't just about Daniel Walsh anymore. It was about all of them. The ones who never came home. The ones who came home and were forgotten. The ones still living with the weight of silence. George cleared his throat. You all see this young man, he said, pointing to the casket. This one right here. He's not just a soldier. He's someone's son. Someone's friend. Someone's brother. He stood up for something. And now it's our turn. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Some nodded. Some wept silently. A few stood straighter, as if reminded of something they'd let go of long ago. Maggie Walsh stepped forward again, Emma clinging gently to her side. She placed a hand on George's shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. He would have liked you. George tipped his head. He earned every bit of this, ma'am. Then he turned and walked back toward the crowd, but he didn't disappear into it. He remained at its edge, standing with quiet reverence, his cap still pressed to his chest. Sam's eyes didn't leave the casket, but inside, something shifted. Not closure. Not yet. But confirmation. This was what Danny had wanted. A procession not through empty hallways, but through hearts. Through people who had seen too much and forgotten how to feel. Through strangers who now stood still because they sensed, deep down, that this was one of those rare moments when the world remembered to care. From the overhead speakers came a voice, not the usual automated announcements but a live, hesitant message from someone in the airport's control room. Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. A fallen soldier is being escorted through our terminal today. We ask for your respect during this procession. Please remain in place and stand if you are able. The speaker clicked off. Silence returned, heavier now, but also warmer. Like the terminal had become something more than a place of transit. It had become a place of memory. A woman knelt beside her child and whispered, "That's what honor looks like." A pilot passing between gates paused to offer a silent salute. A janitor stood beside his cart, eyes wide, hat held to his chest. It was as if the air itself had changed. Sam's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes still locked ahead. He didn't cry. He didn't shift. He just breathed, slowly, deeply, and prepared for what came next. Because the procession hadn't yet begun. But now the world was ready for it. For the first time in decades, the terminal at Washington's busiest airport fell completely silent. The kind of silence that didn't just settle over the space but soaked into it, like a sacred hush had wrapped its arms around every wall, window, and whisper. It wasn't ordered. It wasn't announced with horns or banners. It was spontaneous. Organic. A reverence sparked by one man's refusal to step aside and one flag that demanded to be seen. Sergeant Sam Harper stood at the head of the casket with the grace of a soldier and the stillness of a stone. His white gloves were folded in perfect military form, his gaze forward, his body unmoving as if anchored to the earth by duty alone. Travelers who had never met him and never would stood behind stanchions or leaned against terminal walls with bowed heads, quiet breaths, and hearts somehow softened. What had been an ordinary Friday morning had become something else entirely, an unspoken communion between strangers and sacrifice. At Gate A2, flight attendants ceased calling groups. TSA agents lowered their hands from where they'd been directing traffic and simply stood still. Even the airline's ticket agents, so often buried in their screens and printouts, lifted their eyes and watched. Somewhere down the hall, a child's soft question broke the quiet. "Mom, why is everyone stopped?" The mother bent down to whisper, "Because someone brave is coming home." And then there was stillness again. James Thornton stood off to the side, his clipboard hanging limply at his side, the authority in his posture slowly eroding under the sheer weight of the moment unfolding around him. He had underestimated what this would mean. What it would become. He had seen this as a disruption, an operational snag in his carefully balanced machine. But now, surrounded by silence and the unyielding presence of a single soldier in dress uniform, Thornton realized he had misjudged the depth of something he never understood. He had come with a schedule. What he had walked into was a sacred rite. Across the terminal, a pair of elderly veterans helped each other to their feet. One of them leaned heavily on a cane, his hand shaking as he raised it to his brow in a trembling salute. People nearby saw it and followed. Men and women, young and old, slowly raised their hands, placed them over their hearts, or simply stood straighter. No one told them to. No one needed to. They were participating in something bigger than themselves. Sam could feel them without looking. He didn't need to turn to know the atmosphere had changed. It was in the air he breathed, thicker now with a kind of living memory. He could almost hear Danny's voice behind him, laughing, nudging, whispering jokes about being the center of attention. But there was something else too, something deeper, an understanding that this was what Danny had wanted. Not just return, but recognition. Not just to come home, but to be seen. And Sam had made that happen. With every refusal to yield, every firm response, every step he would take in the minutes to come, he was ensuring that a promise made under desert stars was honored in front of the world. Maggie Walsh stood with Emma just a few paces back from the casket. She had tears in her eyes, but her chin was high. She held her granddaughter's hand tightly, drawing strength not from her own years as a military nurse or from her memories of Danny's childhood, but from the quiet fortitude of the man who now stood guarding her son. She watched Sam Harper with an expression of gratitude and awe, seeing not just a soldier, but a vessel for something eternal, respect, integrity, love. Emma tugged gently on her sleeve. "Why's nobody moving, Grandma?" Maggie leaned close, her voice trembling but clear. "Because your uncle matters, baby. And when someone matters this much, the world should stop for a moment." The honor guard began forming behind Sam, 5 other soldiers who had arrived in silence and moved like shadows into their positions. Their uniforms matched his in cut and color, but each face was different, carrying the same solemn duty. With perfect synchrony, they aligned behind the casket, their movements slow, practiced, filled with gravity. The lead NCO stepped to Sam's side and gave the faintest nod. It was time. Sam inhaled once, deeply, then exhaled without sound. He reached into the pocket above his heart and brushed his fingers against the photograph he always carried. The one with him and Danny, grinning in the desert, younger, untouched by war. That image was his anchor. It kept his posture square and his heart steady. He placed his right hand gently against the handle of the casket platform. His left joined it. The honor guard did the same. One heartbeat passed. Then 2. And then they lifted. The weight was real. Heavy. Final. And yet in that moment, it felt as if they carried not just the remains of a fallen soldier but the collected reverence of every person in that terminal. Their steps began slow, the rhythmic cadence of boots on tile echoing like a drumbeat of remembrance. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply watched, holding their breath, witnessing something pure. As they passed, a man in a suit lowered his phone and stood straighter. A woman closed her laptop. A teenager removed her earbuds and pressed a hand over her heart. Even the boarding announcements fell away, as if the airport's very systems had chosen to be silent. Sam walked as if his life depended on it. As if every inch of ground he covered was sacred territory. Each step a tribute. Each pause a promise kept. He didn't look at the faces around him, but he could feel them, the way they leaned in, the way their hearts reached out. For Danny. For all the Dannys they had never known. The standstill had become a corridor. The corridor had become a procession. And the procession had become a memory that none of them would ever forget. The moment the procession began, the terminal transformed. What had once been a bustling hub of gates and destinations became something closer to a sanctuary. Time didn't stop, but it bowed its head. Sam Harper walked in slow cadence, every footfall deliberate, every motion practiced through years of silent devotion, but today each movement held the gravity of a promise made under the weight of grief and brotherhood. The flag-draped casket moved with him, carried by the strength of the honor guard and the invisible force of a nation's reverence. The crowd parted like water, forming a solemn corridor down the length of the concourse, and in that corridor stood people from every walk of life, businessmen in suits, tourists with neck pillows and camera bags, soldiers in uniform, janitors in coveralls, mothers holding children who would never understand what they were witnessing but would feel its weight all the same. Maggie Walsh stood near the beginning of that corridor, her arms still wrapped gently around Emma's shoulders. Her spine remained straight, but her fingers trembled slightly as she watched the movement come closer, as she watched the flag she had folded and packed in care packages now laid flat and silent across the box that held her son. She took one small step forward, then another, and the people nearby instinctively moved aside. No one needed to be told who she was. It was in her eyes, in her steps, in the pain she wore like a uniform of her own. As the casket drew parallel to her position, Maggie stepped out into the center of the corridor, directly into the path of the procession. Sam halted immediately, raising one hand gently as a signal. The honor guard stopped as one, the entire terminal holding its collective breath as the woman approached her son. The flag shimmered under the overhead lights, and for a long, heart-wrenching moment, Maggie said nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't kneel. She simply placed one hand on the edge of the casket, palm flat, fingers trembling slightly as she leaned in and whispered something that only Daniel could hear. Sam watched her, his jaw clenched, his breath still. He felt the intensity of her presence, the strength behind her sorrow. She straightened again and turned slowly to face the silent crowd. Her eyes scanned the faces before her, not searching, but inviting, asking the question her voice now carried. "My son loved this country," she said, her voice quiet but filled with power. "He gave his life for it. But he didn't just want to be remembered for how he died. He wanted to be remembered for how he lived. He was kind. He was funny. He wrote his sister letters and promised her stories. He gave more than he took. And he asked me, if anything ever happened, to make sure he came home the right way." No one moved. The words landed like raindrops on stone, soaking through slowly, leaving no part untouched. "He didn't want back hallways," she continued. "He didn't want to be hidden. He wanted to walk home through the front, because he believed people should see what sacrifice looks like. And I believe he was right." She looked over at Sam now, locking eyes with him, and for the first time since the plane had landed, Sam allowed himself to look back. In her eyes, he saw gratitude deeper than any thank you. He saw understanding. He saw approval. And then, Quietly, she stepped to the side and took Emma's hand again. Emma held her drawing in her free hand, the one she had made for her Uncle Danny, folded but still vibrant with its childlike colors. As the casket passed, she reached out and pressed it gently onto the flag, letting it rest there for a moment before it was caught by one of the honor guard and tucked carefully beneath the folded corner. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "You promised you'd come back." The procession resumed, slow and steady. Sam's eyes returned to the path ahead, but his heart carried that moment like a medal. He had escorted many caskets in his career, each one solemn, each one sacred, but none like this. None that felt like it could break the air around him or shift the rhythm of an entire building. This wasn't just a return. It was a reckoning. A reminder. As the honor guard approached the heart of the concourse, more people gathered along the sides. A security guard removed his hat. A teenage boy lowered his skateboard and stood up straight. A pilot paused between gates, saluting crisply. And through it all, Sam walked, measured and unwavering, a man bound by duty, fueled by memory, and carried by something stronger than grief, purpose. The voice over the intercom didn't interrupt. No boarding announcements. No gate changes. Just quiet. It was as if even the airport itself had become aware that today, it was not a place of departure. It was a place of return. Behind Sam, Maggie and Emma followed silently, escorted by airport staff who no longer thought about schedules or numbers. They walked slowly, respectfully, the weight of their presence turning every step into a statement. And somewhere in the terminal, someone began humming a slow, familiar tune, Taps. It was faint, just a few notes, but others heard and joined, humming in unison. The music carried no words, but none were needed. The message was clear. When they reached the far end of the corridor where the black hearse waited outside, gleaming beneath the pale morning sun, Sam came to a full stop. The doors opened. The honor guard shifted into formation. One by one, they lifted the casket and carried it forward, their boots in perfect synchrony, their faces etched with solemn reverence. The crowd, still and watching, didn't breathe until the casket was placed with the same care it had been carried. Sam remained at attention, eyes locked forward. Maggie stepped beside him and placed a hand on his arm. "He told me about you," she said, her voice soft. "Said if he didn't make it, you'd keep your word." Sam finally turned to her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "And I will." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The black hearse waited just outside the glass doors like a sentinel of finality, its polished frame gleaming beneath the overcast sky. Its quiet presence was a punctuation mark to the sacred procession that had slowly carved its way through the heart of a place designed for movement, not for memory. Sergeant Sam Harper stood at the threshold, his gloved hands at his sides, the weight of silence pressing down on his shoulders as heavily as the casket had only moments before. The honor guard had completed their transfer, their formation now at rest, but Sam remained in place, unyielding. Maggie and Emma stood a few feet away, still watching, still holding on to the space between grief and grace, the little girl clinging to the warmth of her grandmother's hand as if it could protect her from the meaning of this moment. Inside the terminal, the crowd continued to hold their breath. The noise of a typical day, boarding calls, rolling suitcases, impatient mutters, had not returned. Not yet. There was an understanding, unspoken but deeply felt, that the silence must hold a little longer. That nothing should interrupt this last stand. And that's when the footsteps returned. Sharp. Confident. Clipped against the tile like a hammer against anvil. James Thornton approached again, the clipboard gone now, but the tightness in his mouth and the clench of his jaw said everything. He had waited for the moment to pass, watched from a distance as reverence took root, but now he was back. And this time, he wasn't holding back his irritation. "Sergeant Harper," he said firmly, stepping up beside Sam without invitation. I didn't appreciate being publicly undermined. You may have won the crowd, but this airport has protocols. You made a choice today that put personal sentiment ahead of operational responsibility. Sam didn't turn to face him. His eyes remained fixed on the hearse, his spine straight. I carried out my duty, he said, voice calm and cold as stone. Exactly as it was intended. Thornton scoffed. You disobeyed a direct instruction to reroute. You turned a controlled environment into a media event. This isn't about a single soldier anymore. It's about precedence. Sam turned now, slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked with Thornton's, and in them was not anger, not even contempt, but something more dangerous to a man like James Thornton, conviction. It was never about a single soldier, Sam said. It was about every soldier who's ever come home in silence. It was about a mother's promise. A child's drawing. A vow made between brothers under foreign stars. And it was about honoring the dead in a way the living could witness. That's what this moment was about. You're not above the system, Thornton snapped, his voice rising. No, Sam said, unblinking. But there are things older than your system. Things like respect. Things like sacrifice. Things that don't answer to a clipboard. Thornton stepped closer, lowering his voice. You touched me earlier. Laid hands on an airport official. That alone is grounds for removal. I could file a report today and have you barred from this facility. Sam's jaw tensed, but his voice didn't rise. I didn't touch you. I stopped you. From desecrating a flag. From crossing a line you didn't even realize existed. You assaulted me, Thornton insisted. And if not for the cameras and the crowd, I would have had you escorted out by security on the spot. But you didn't, Sam said. Because even you knew, in that moment, that the crowd wasn't with you. That you weren't in control anymore. Thornton bristled, but before he could speak, another voice cut in. I think that's enough, said a calm but authoritative tone from behind them. Both men turned to see a woman approaching from the far end of the terminal. She wore a blazer over a charcoal dress, civilian clothes that couldn't hide the precision of her posture or the military bearing in her stride. Her face was composed, but her eyes were sharp and direct. She extended a hand as she arrived. Captain Evelyn Carter. Airport Director. Former Army Aviation, 20 years active. Sam gave a crisp nod. Ma'am. Thornton stepped forward. Director, I was just explaining that Sergeant Harper. You were explaining something to a man who did exactly what I approved days ago, Carter interrupted. I signed off on the full honors procession through the main concourse. I was briefed personally on Sergeant Harper's request. And I authorized it in writing. Thornton opened his mouth, then closed it. Your concerns about delays and operational flow were noted, Carter continued. But this was bigger than flow. Bigger than convenience. This was a statement of who we are. And I'm proud of what just happened in this terminal. She turned to Sam. Sergeant, I owe you an apology for any resistance you faced. You upheld the highest standard of military conduct. And you reminded us all of what we too often forget. Sam nodded once. Thank you, ma'am. Carter looked back at Thornton. You can take your grievance and file it if you like. But know this, it'll be reviewed by people who understand the meaning of a folded flag. And I think you'll find you've misread the moment. Thornton lowered his gaze, chastened but not yet humbled. Understood, he muttered. Carter addressed the terminal now, speaking into a nearby PA system with clarity and composure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience today. A soldier has come home, and your presence, your silence, your respect. It has meant more than you know. You were part of something honorable. Thank you for standing still. As she clicked off the microphone, a smattering of applause rose, gentle at first, then growing. Not loud, not boisterous, but heartfelt. Sam didn't react. He simply turned back to the hearse, straightened his frame, and offered a final salute as the doors were gently closed. His promise had not only been kept. It had been witnessed. And now, the journey to Arlington would begin. As the hearse pulled away from the terminal and merged into the long access road that led toward the military convoy waiting beyond the airport perimeter, Sam Harper remained motionless, his posture as disciplined as if the casket were still at his side. The crowd had begun to stir again, slowly returning to the rhythms of travel, but no one did so carelessly. Conversations were quieter. Steps were slower. Eyes followed the hearse as far as they could, as though letting it vanish without acknowledgement would be a betrayal of everything they had just witnessed. Maggie and Emma stood near the edge of the concourse, their hands still intertwined, their hearts heavy with grief but carried now by something else, an invisible strength born from dignity and remembrance. Maggie hadn't said another word since her final touch to the flag, but the steadiness in her eyes told Sam she had found the peace she had come seeking. Sam turned, finally releasing himself from the invisible tether that had bound him to that terminal floor, and stepped toward the waiting officers to confirm next steps. It was then that he noticed the sudden shift in energy near the terminal entrance. Heads turned. Shoulders straightened. Airport staff who had been lingering by security suddenly stood at attention. Sam followed their gaze and immediately recognized the figure walking in from the passenger arrival gate, flanked by two aides but walking several paces ahead of them with the unmistakable bearing of command. Major General Howard Monroe. The sight of the man sent a ripple through the gathered personnel. The general wasn't just a name. He was a legend in military circles, a veteran of 3 combat tours, former commander of a joint task force in the Middle East, and now, advisor to the Department of Defense on ceremonial military protocol. His presence here was not part of any press release. No one had announced his arrival. But the weight of his appearance said what no press release ever could: this moment mattered far beyond the bounds of airport walls. Sam came to attention as Monroe approached, and before he could speak, the general offered a crisp salute. Sam returned it, his expression unchanging, though his mind raced with questions. "At ease, Sergeant Harper," Monroe said, his voice low but commanding, with that gravel-toned authority of a man who had given orders under fire and never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Sam lowered his hand slowly. "Sir. I was briefed on what happened here," Monroe continued, his gaze flicking briefly toward the dispersing crowd, then back to Sam. "I read every word. But what I've seen with my own eyes tells me more than any report could. You turned a logistical obstacle into a national reminder." "Just doing my duty, sir," Sam said simply. "No, Sergeant. You went beyond duty," Monroe replied. "You turned this terminal into Arlington. You didn't just carry a casket. You carried tradition, sacrifice, and integrity. And you made sure they weren't left behind on a tarmac." Monroe glanced at Carter, the airport director, who now stood a few feet away, her arms folded respectfully. "Director Carter, I trust you've seen the footage already circulating online." She nodded. "Yes, sir. And I stand by everything Sergeant Harper did. I signed off on the route. He executed it with honor." Monroe turned back to Sam. "You had every opportunity to yield. To comply. To let it pass through the background unnoticed. And you chose instead to stand. I've read your file, Harper. Tomb guard for 5 years. Flawless record. Numerous citations. You've spent your life honoring those we lost. But today, you honored all of us who are still here." Sam nodded once. "It wasn't about me, sir. It was about Danny Walsh. He saved my life. I made him a promise. That he wouldn't come back to silence." Monroe's eyes narrowed slightly. "Walsh. That name. I knew his father. Captain Henry Walsh. I served with him in Iraq. Good man. Brave man. He died saving civilians during a compound raid. Sam's chest tightened. Danny never talked much about his father. Only said he wanted to come home the right way. Said his dad would have wanted that. He was right, Monroe said. And today, you honored 2 generations with one march. Sam glanced briefly at the path the casket had taken. I just didn't want him to be forgotten. Too many of us come home hidden. I've watched more caskets roll through service corridors than I can count. Not this time. Not for him. Monroe placed a firm hand on Sam's shoulder. You've reminded us that honor doesn't live in procedures. It lives in people. In choices made when no one's looking. Or when everyone is. Behind them, Maggie stepped forward, Emma at her side. Monroe noticed immediately and turned to greet them with warmth that cut through his otherwise formal demeanor. Ma'am, he said, gently shaking Maggie's hand. Your son was a hero. Maggie's voice was soft but unwavering. Thank you, General. But today, I think Sergeant Harper reminded us what a hero really looks like. Emma looked up, wide-eyed. Are you a real general? Monroe smiled, crouching slightly. Yes, ma'am, I am. Emma looked toward Sam. Uncle Danny said Sergeant Harper was the bravest man he ever met. Monroe stood and looked back at Sam. I'd say your nephew was right. For a long moment, they all stood there, soldier, general, mother, child, not as strangers, not as roles, but as witnesses to something sacred. Then Monroe stepped back, gesturing toward the exit. Sergeant, I'd like you to ride with the family to Arlington. I'll ensure your presence at the interment is honored properly. Sam hesitated. I'm just the escort, sir. Today, you are more than that, Monroe said. You are a keeper of the promise. Let's finish this the way it was meant to be finished. And with that, they began walking. Not rushed. Not hurried. Just side by side. Toward the road that led to Arlington. Toward the final resting place of a brother returned with honor. As the convoy rolled away from the terminal, something remarkable lingered behind. The moment hadn't ended with the sound of engines or the closing of doors. It remained, like the echo of a hymn, etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Travelers continued to stand near the windows, some still silent, others now murmuring softly, trying to name what they had just felt. And among them, a young flight attendant named Rosa Garcia stood with both hands over her heart, watching until the last taillight vanished. It wasn't the first soldier's casket she had seen in an airport, but it was the first time everything had stopped for one. She turned to the woman beside her, an older traveler with tears running freely down her cheeks, and whispered, "We should do something more." Outside, beyond the terminal and across the drive where traffic had been temporarily paused, Sergeant Sam Harper sat quietly in the lead vehicle. His white gloves rested in his lap now, but his posture was still formal. His eyes remained ahead, but his mind had not moved on. It was still with Danny, with the final salute, with the weight of the flag between his hands. The roads were clear as they moved toward the cemetery, the motorcade escorted by law enforcement vehicles and a scattering of Patriot Guard riders who had assembled quickly after hearing the call. They rode with American flags rippling from the backs of their bikes, their presence both silent and thunderous. Sam didn't speak. In the seat beside him, Maggie Walsh held Emma close, and the child clutched a photo in her small hands. The same drawing she had placed on the casket, now returned to her by a quiet member of the honor guard, laminated and preserved. Her eyes stayed on the road, but her thoughts were on her uncle, the man she would now only know through stories and pictures and the silence he left behind. Back at the airport, something was stirring. Rosa had spoken to her supervisor, who had spoken to the director, who had in turn sent word through the terminal's PA system. And then, almost without instruction, passengers began to form a line. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't an event. It was a decision. One by one, they left their seats, stepped away from their gates, set down their luggage, and moved toward the wide concourse where the casket had passed. They stood in 2 lines, shoulder to shoulder, facing one another across the path. Some were veterans. Some were students. Some were grandparents. There were no rules, no ceremony, no microphones or speeches. Just people choosing to honor what they had seen. Airport workers joined them. Pilots. Janitors. Mechanics with grease on their hands. They formed a human corridor of honor, a tribute in silence. Where Danny had been carried once, now stood the memory of that march, made flesh by the people who had watched it happen. And as this spontaneous corridor of honor formed, someone near the center raised a small American flag. Another placed a hand over their heart. A mother lifted her baby so the child could see. At the far end, George Miller returned, standing tall in his worn USMC cap, saluting once more with tears pooling in his tired eyes. No one asked for recognition. No one needed to be told why they were there. The corridor stood in quiet unity, a rare, pure reflection of something the world often forgot, shared reverence. And across the internet, the moment spread. A journalist who had been traveling for a tech conference uploaded a short video. 30 seconds. No commentary. Just the flag-draped casket moving slowly between rows of silent strangers, Sergeant Harper leading with unshaken grace. It went viral before the motorcade even reached Arlington. By the time the vehicles entered the gates of the National Cemetery, flags had been lowered across several state buildings in tribute. The Department of Defense issued a formal commendation recognizing the unique display of civilian respect. And messages began pouring in, some from soldiers stationed overseas, some from others, some from people who didn't know anyone in uniform but now understood what sacrifice looked like. But none of that mattered to Sam in that moment. He wasn't concerned with cameras or headlines. He wasn't thinking about ceremonies or citations. He was thinking about Danny. About the promise. About the boy who once fell asleep in a desert bunker talking about flying a plane over the Grand Canyon. About the friend who had tackled him to the ground and saved his life without hesitation. About the man who didn't come home, until now. The vehicle came to a stop near Section 60. The final resting place was already prepared, the chairs for the family arranged beneath a white awning, the rifle team standing at attention, bugler waiting just beyond view. Sam stepped out first, straightened his jacket, and walked to the back of the hearse. The honor guard reassembled, each member moving with mechanical precision, and once more, they lifted the casket. Sam took his position at the head, his face unreadable, but his heart locked into each step. As they moved across the lawn, the soft sound of birds filled the quiet between breaths. The green grass beneath their boots, the marble stones stretching out in perfect rows, it was all so painfully still. As it should be. When they reached the stand beside the grave, the honor guard placed the casket down with unmatched reverence. Sam took one step back and saluted, the motion slow, the angle sharp, his eyes fixed on the stars in the flag that lay draped over his friend. Maggie and Emma took their seats. The chaplain stepped forward and began to speak, but Sam heard none of it. His ears filled with memory, Danny's voice, Danny's laugh, the words spoken under a sky of desert stars. Bring me home the right way. Let them see. And they had. The country had seen. The people had stood. And in that stand, Danny's life had become more than a name on a stone. He had become a symbol. A brother honored. A promise fulfilled. The air at Arlington carried a silence unlike anywhere else in the world, a silence not born of emptiness but of memory. It wasn't quiet because nothing had happened there, it was quiet because everything had. As the honor guard finished placing the casket atop the wooden frame beside the open grave, the trees swayed gently, their branches bowing as if in acknowledgement. Sergeant Sam Harper stepped into position at the head of the formation, his back straight, eyes fixed forward, his gloved hands resting against the small of his back. His mind didn't wander, though his heart was full. The moment had arrived, the final steps of a journey that had begun not just on the tarmac but years ago, in the dust of a foreign land, with laughter between brothers and a promise whispered under starlight. Family sat in two neat rows under the canopy, Maggie Walsh in black with Emma beside her, the child clinging tightly to the laminated drawing once intended as a gift, now a relic of farewell. Sam caught the girl's eye for a brief moment. She didn't smile. She only looked at him the way children look at the moon, as something distant and steady and somehow eternal. He gave her the slightest nod. She nodded back, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. The bugler raised his horn. The first note of taps pierced the air like a thread of gold stitching across the blue sky. It held everything in it, grief, reverence, finality, and Sam felt each rising tone like a heartbeat syncing with the pulse of the nation. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. He had heard it 100 times, each performance just as solemn, but never this personal. These notes weren't for ceremony. They were for Danny. When the final note faded into the wind, 3 riflemen stepped forward. They raised their weapons in unison and fired the first volley, the sound cracking through the still air like thunder over marble. The second volley followed. Then the third. Birds scattered from the nearby trees, and somewhere, someone's hand found their chest. Sam didn't move. He had already said goodbye in 100 ways, but this was the moment the world joined him. The flag detail moved next, stepping forward with precision as they began the ceremonial folding of the United States flag. 13 crisp folds, each one deliberate, each one a gesture that carried centuries of meaning. As they completed the final triangle, the lead soldier stepped forward, the flag held tightly in white-gloved hands, and turned to face Maggie. The folded flag, compact and perfect, was now the last embrace from a country to its fallen son. Sam watched as the soldier bent down and spoke the words with solemn gravity. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Maggie accepted the flag with both hands, her expression composed but glassy with tears. She didn't cry openly. She had done that already, in private, in the darkness of her own thoughts. What she held now was more than fabric. It was the weight of legacy, of sacrifice, of the boy who used to ride a bicycle through her backyard pretending to be a pilot. Sam stepped forward then, not as part of the official protocol, but with the silent blessing of every officer present. He approached Maggie slowly, removed something from the inside pocket of his uniform, and held it out to her. It was the photograph, worn, folded at the corners, but whole. The one of him and Danny, grinning in the sand, 2 boys pretending war couldn't touch them. Maggie took it with trembling fingers. He carried this with him, Sam said softly. Every deployment. Every mission. She looked down at the image, her thumb tracing her son's smile. He always said you were the quiet one, she murmured. Said you were the reason he ever made it home the first time. Sam's voice barely carried. He was the reason I made it home. They stood in silence a moment longer before Sam turned to Emma. The girl stepped forward, cradling something in her other hand. A daisy. Simple. White. Unassuming. She walked toward the casket, her step small but sure, and placed the flower gently atop the wood. She didn't speak. She only whispered, so soft only she could hear, "You're my hero, Uncle Danny." Sam stepped back, eyes burning, chest tight, but his composure intact. He had stood guard for strangers, for soldiers without names, for the unknown and the unnamed. But today, he had stood for a friend. A brother. And now, as the final words of the chaplain echoed through the air, he prepared for one last march. The honor guard reformed. Sam took his position at the front once more. And as they began the final walk away from the gravesite, their pace slow and even, every boot in time with the next, the rows of headstones blurred at the edges of Sam's vision. Not from motion, but from memory. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't care, but because he had done what he came to do. He had brought Danny home. Through terminals and confrontation. Through silence and defiance. Through the hearts of strangers and the prayers of family. Through every step that mattered. The march began. And with it, a story was sealed in the earth of Arlington, a story of courage, of friendship, of one man who refused to let another be forgotten. The sun hung low above Arlington as the final echo of footsteps faded from the ceremonial path. The crowd had begun to disperse, drifting away in silence, not out of detachment but out of reverence, like retreating from sacred ground. Yet Maggie Walsh and little Emma remained. They stood beside the grave long after the honor guard had stepped away, after the bugler had packed his horn, after the chaplain had closed his prayer book. Sam Harper stayed too, a quiet shadow at the edge of their mourning, not out of duty anymore, but something deeper. Something closer to belonging. Maggie knelt by the grave, running her fingers gently along the edge of the freshly turned earth, her palm resting on the polished wood where her son lay beneath the flag. She didn't speak. There were no more words. She had spoken them all over the years, across letters and calls and prayers sent to distant deserts and dark skies. Now she had only silence, and strangely, it felt like enough. Emma stood beside her, the laminated drawing still pressed against her chest like a shield. Sam watched her, this little girl with grief far too big for her small frame, and wondered how someone so young could carry loss so gracefully. After several long minutes, Maggie stood slowly, the joints in her knees protesting, her hand lingering on the casket before she finally let go. She turned to Sam, eyes red but steady. "You kept your promise," she said, her voice raw but strong. "You brought my boy home with honor." Sam removed his cover and lowered his head. "He deserved more than I could give, ma'am. But I gave him all I had." She stepped toward him and reached out, not with hesitation, but with the instinct of a mother who had raised a soldier and understood the unspoken burdens these men carried. Her hand gripped his firmly. "You gave him back to me," she said. "That's everything." Sam reached into the breast pocket of his uniform and carefully pulled out the photograph once more. It had been returned to him after the ceremony, but it didn't feel like his to keep. The image was worn now, edges soft from years of handling, creases crossing it like old scars. But the faces remained vivid, two boys in the desert, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning as if death couldn't touch them. He held it out to Maggie. "This was always his," he said. "I think it should stay with you and Emma now." She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his. Her eyes welled with fresh tears, not from sorrow this time, but from something warmer. "He talked about this photo in every letter," she said. "Said it reminded him why he came back each time. Said you were his compass." Sam's throat tightened. "He was mine." Maggie turned and crouched beside Emma, placing the photo into her granddaughter's small hands. Emma looked at it for a long moment, her brows drawn in quiet concentration. "Is this where they were friends?" she asked. "This is where they became brothers," Maggie answered. Emma nodded solemnly. Then she walked to the casket once more, her tiny shoes crunching softly against the gravel. She stood on tiptoe, stretching as far as her little body would allow, and laid the photo gently across the flag. Her other hand reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a single daisy, delicate and white, its stem slightly bent from the ride. She laid it next to the photograph and whispered, "So you'll always know who you are." Sam looked away, not because he couldn't handle the sight, but because the emotion threatened to overwhelm the structure of his training. He had been taught to be unshakable, immovable in the face of loss. But this little girl and her daisy had undone something in him he hadn't realized was still locked away. A part of him that had survived bullets, sandstorms, and the quiet toll of burial after burial, but couldn't quite survive the gentleness of a child saying goodbye. Maggie stepped beside him again. "You ever think about leaving the guard?" she asked quietly. Sam shook his head. "Not until now." She studied him. Maybe it's time to rest. I don't know how, he said. Then maybe you start by remembering that you're not alone, she replied. They stood in silence for a few more minutes, letting the wind pass through them, rustling the leaves, brushing the daisy where it lay. Finally, Maggie turned and guided Emma away from the grave. Sam watched them walk toward the car that waited to take them home, the little girl glancing back once, giving a small wave. Sam raised his hand in response, the gesture crisp, though slower than usual, and held it until they disappeared behind the hedges of stone. He looked back at the grave, where the photo and the daisy still rested against the flag. He stepped forward, adjusted the edge of the picture so it wouldn't blow away, and knelt beside the casket for the first and last time. His hand rested gently on the wood, and he bowed his head. "I brought you home, Danny," he whispered. "Front door. Just like you asked." He stayed there for a while, unmoving. Long enough for the sun to dip a little lower, for the shadows to stretch. He thought about every step that brought him here, from the promise in the desert to the confrontation in the terminal, to the silence of the crowd that had watched as a man kept his word. It hadn't just been about honoring one soldier. It had been about giving the world a reason to stop. To remember. To care. He rose slowly, adjusted his uniform, and placed his cap back on. He gave one final salute, sharp and steady, the kind that didn't ask for applause. Then he turned and walked away. And behind him, the daisy remained. A small, simple symbol. Of love. Of remembrance. And of a promise fulfilled. By the time Sam Harper returned to the airport later that afternoon to retrieve his duffel from the security office, the sky had turned to ash. A thin layer of cloud stretched across the horizon like a blanket pulled over the sun, and a gentle wind drifted through the parking structures, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel and autumn leaves. He moved through the terminal without ceremony, wearing civilian clothes now, pressed slacks, a plain button-down, shoes that didn't gleam but still knew how to walk with purpose. The contrast was sharp, but it felt appropriate. The uniform had done its part. Now the man beneath it would carry what came next. As he stepped back through the doors of the main concourse, the memory of the procession struck him like a slow tide. The faces. The silence. The weight of the casket in his hands. The click of boots. The girl with the daisy. It was all still there, imprinted on the space even though the crowd was gone. He passed by the same stretch of corridor where Danny's body had been carried. The tiles looked the same, but he swore he could still hear the echo of the steps, the soft hush of reverence that had washed over the place like a prayer. Then he saw him. James Thornton was standing near the information desk, no clipboard, no entourage, just a man in a gray suit looking smaller than Sam remembered. His jacket was slightly wrinkled, his tie a little off-center. He held a coffee in one hand and seemed unsure of what to do with the other. When his eyes met Sam's, he straightened instinctively, setting down the cup and adjusting his cuffs as if trying to recapture the authority he had once wielded like armor. Sam didn't pause. He kept walking, closing the distance until they stood a few feet apart, the tension between them a live wire. Thornton cleared his throat. "Sergeant Harper." "Not Sergeant today," Sam replied. "Just Sam." Thornton nodded once. He looked away for a moment, then back, as if sorting through a dozen pre-written scripts and discarding each. What came out instead was halting, raw. "I was wrong." Sam didn't respond. He let the words hang there, demanding their own weight. "I didn't understand," Thornton went on, his voice quieter now. "I thought I did. I thought I was just doing my job. Keeping everything moving. That's what I'm trained to do. But you stopped the world for a minute. And I didn't realize until too late how much it needed to stop." Sam studied him, not out of judgment but consideration. He didn't see a villain. He saw a man shaped by systems, schedules, deadlines. A man who had never been asked to slow down for grief until it stood in front of him, dressed in black and gold, carrying a folded promise through a sea of strangers. Thornton looked down. I've run this airport for 17 years. I've prided myself on efficiency, control. I've dealt with terrorist threats, blizzards, cyber attacks. But I've never felt more helpless than I did this morning when I saw the way people looked at you. At the flag. At the family. I tried to stop it, and all I ended up doing was exposing what I didn't understand. Sam finally spoke. You touched the flag. Thornton winced. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. You didn't think, Sam said. That's what hurts the most. Not malice. Indifference. You saw a casket and thought of delays. I saw a brother. His mother saw her son. That little girl saw her hero. And you saw an inconvenience. Thornton's eyes were red now, rimmed with fatigue or shame or both. I can't take it back, he said. But I want to learn from it. Sam folded his arms across his chest. Then start here. Understand that a soldier's journey doesn't end in war. It ends in how we remember them. In how we stand for them when they can't stand for themselves. That flag you almost touched. It's more than cloth. It's every letter home. Every final breath. Every night spent wondering if the morning will come. You don't touch that flag unless you're prepared to carry the weight it represents. Thornton nodded slowly. I believe you now. I believe all of it. For a moment, neither man spoke. The terminal moved around them in slow, quiet motion. A child dragged a suitcase. A gate agent called out a boarding group. A plane soared silently beyond the glass. Life was returning to its rhythm, but not the same rhythm as before. Something had shifted. Thornton looked down at the floor, then back at Sam. I told my staff this morning to let the moment pass. To clear the area and keep operations flowing. But they didn't listen. Because of you. Because they saw what I didn't. Sam's gaze softened. They didn't listen because something inside them already knew. You just had to remember it. Thornton reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded printout. He handed it to Sam. Thought you might want to see this. Sam unfolded the paper. It was a screenshot from a news article, an aerial photo of the procession, Sam at the front, the honor guard flanking the flag-draped casket, a corridor of passengers lining both sides like silent sentinels. The headline read, Airport stands still as soldier comes home, one man's promise brings a nation to pause. Sam looked at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. You should know, Thornton said, the director's making it permanent. The main concourse will now host all approved military repatriation ceremonies. Full honors. Every time. Sam gave a slow nod. That's a start. Thornton extended a hand. It hung there between them, uncertain. Sam looked at it for a moment, then grasped it firmly. The handshake wasn't warm. It wasn't ceremonial. But it was real. As Sam turned to leave, Thornton called after him. You ever need anything here, anything at all, you have my word. You won't walk alone. Sam didn't look back, but his voice reached across the space between them. Neither did he. And with that, he disappeared into the rhythm of the crowd. But where he had walked, the ground remembered. And where he had stood, people would not forget. 2 days had passed since Sergeant Sam Harper walked the corridor with Danny's casket. The airport had returned to its usual rhythm, flashing departure boards, rolling suitcases, the faint static of intercom announcements. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Conversations carried a softer tone. Security lines moved with just a little more patience. And near Gate A9, the gate where it all began, something new had quietly taken root. A temporary plaque now stood beside the large windows overlooking the tarmac. It wasn't grand. No gold trim, no dramatic lighting. Just brushed metal, with words etched in calm defiance of time, in honor of Staff Sergeant Daniel Walsh, and all who never came home. May we never move too fast to remember. Above it, framed in solemn dignity, was the now famous photo of the silent crowd as the honor guard passed, Sam leading, the flag at the center, dignity rippling through stillness. Travelers stopped as they passed. Some took photos. Others placed a hand on the wall. Most said nothing at all, but lingered a moment longer than they needed to. Sam didn't return for a ceremony. There wasn't one. That had been the whole point. What had happened that day had not been orchestrated, it had been real. And real things don't need banners or ribbon cuttings to have meaning. But the staff remembered. And they carried it with them like a quiet oath. Inside the staff lounge, Rosa Garcia folded napkins with a deliberate care she hadn't used before. She had been among the first to step forward that day. To stand when others hesitated. To speak when silence clung to the air. That moment had awakened something in her. And today, she found herself scanning each flight manifest for names she now read differently, names marked, military escort, names followed by silent cargo. And when she found one, she alerted the supervisor herself. No one needed to tell her anymore what to do. She knew. Outside at the security checkpoint, Officer Darnell Boone paused each time a service member came through his lane. Not to question, but to shake hands. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't offer small talk. He simply said, "Welcome home," whether they were arriving, departing, or just passing through. He had stood still that day too, his hand resting over his badge, watching as something larger than procedure passed in front of him. And now, no one had to remind him to look beyond the uniform, to see the soul behind it. Upstairs in the control tower, an air traffic controller named Gina Alvarez kept a small flag taped beside her screen. She didn't talk about what she saw that morning, but every time a military flight called in, she greeted them with calm clarity, her voice steady and kind. "This is Delta Tower. We see you. We've got you. Welcome." She had once thought her job was to move metal through clouds. Now she understood it was to guide people safely through the space between separation and reunion. At Gate A9, something even more unexpected was beginning to unfold. A high school teacher named Elaine Markham, traveling back from a conference in Chicago, had been there the day Sam walked by. She had stood in the corridor with tears in her eyes, not because she knew the soldier, but because the stillness reminded her of her father, a Vietnam veteran who had never spoken of his return. That morning, she took a photograph of the silent crowd and the moment it captured. She shared it with her students in a civics class, expecting maybe a short discussion. Instead, it sparked a movement. Her students created a project called Honor First. It was simple. They would write letters, short, handwritten notes of gratitude addressed to unknown soldiers. Veterans. Active duty. Guardsmen. Anyone who had worn the uniform. They mailed them to bases. Hospitals. Even airports. And with each envelope, they enclosed a card printed with the words, "We stood still because someone stood for us. Thank you." The story spread. Soon, schools in other cities joined in. A group of students from a military family in Texas created digital versions. A school in Ohio collected donations to provide bottled water and snack packs to airports for military escorts. And in the center of it all, the image of that solemn moment at Gate A9 continued to echo, a moment made real by the man who had refused to let duty be interrupted by indifference. Back in his apartment, Sam sat quietly with the television off, the flag from Danny's casket folded in its case atop the mantel. He hadn't planned to follow any of it. But he'd started getting letters. Emails. A phone call from a young ROTC cadet who had seen the video and decided to re-enlist after nearly quitting. A message from a woman whose husband had been lost in Iraq and who wrote, "When I saw you walking, I saw him walking home through you." And one more, written in crayon, with uneven spelling and a lopsided drawing of two soldiers side by side under a rainbow. You made him come back. Thank you, Mr. Harper. He hadn't opened his uniform bag since the burial. The gloves were still inside. The boots still lined with sand. But that night, for the first time, he pulled them out and began polishing them. Not because he had a mission coming up, but because he knew now that missions weren't always fought overseas. Sometimes they were fought in airports. In silence. In the space between policy and principle. He picked up a letter from Maggie that had arrived earlier that day. It was short. A single page, handwritten in her neat cursive. You carried my son home. Now let us help you carry what remains. Our door is open, always. Emma would like to show you her drawing again. This time, in person. We hope you'll visit. Sam smiled, folding the letter slowly. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt light. Not empty. But lighter. He looked at the clock. Still early. He grabbed his coat, stepped outside, and began walking, the city hum folding around him. As he passed strangers on the street, he nodded. Some nodded back. Some looked away. Some didn't notice him at all. But one man paused. An older gentleman in a ball cap with the faded insignia of a World War II unit. Their eyes met for a moment. The man gave a knowing look. A hand lifted in a salute, not regulation, but full of memory. Sam returned it without a word. Because sometimes, the quietest salutes carried the loudest truths. And sometimes, the lesson of honor didn't end in the grave. It began in the living. The morning was still when Sam Harper arrived at Arlington once more. The autumn chill crept along the stone pathways, and the dew had not yet lifted from the grass. His boots, now polished to a deep black mirror, moved silently across the gravel. He wore his full dress uniform, not because he had to, but because it felt right. His gloves were snug, his posture straight, and his steps unbroken by hesitation. It was a walk he had taken many times, but never quite like this. This time, it wasn't duty that brought him. It was something deeper, a pull in the chest, an ache in the memory. As he approached the tomb of the unknown soldier, the crisp cadence of the current guard echoed across the marble. Sam paused just short of the perimeter, watching the precision of the soldier on duty, each step a meditation, each turn a promise. For a long while, he said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between the 21 steps held its own language, one that only men like him understood. The relief commander noticed him standing there, the glint of his bars, the steadiness of his stare. He approached slowly, offering a nod of respect before speaking. Sergeant Harper. Sam nodded back. Good to see the rhythm still perfect. It always is, sir. But it's different now. The young man hesitated. People still talk about what you did. Not just here. Everywhere. I didn't do it for people to talk. I know. But maybe that's why they are. They stood together for a few seconds longer, watching as the tomb guard continued his solemn path. Then Sam moved on, weaving through rows of headstones, each name a chapter of sacrifice. He carried no flowers, no fanfare. Only a folded piece of paper in his pocket and a memory on his mind. When he reached Danny's grave, he stopped, exhaled slowly, and let his gaze fall on the small items left by others since the burial, more flowers, a ribbon, a coin, a patch from a Boy Scout troop. But what caught his eye was the daisy. Still there. Wilted now, its petals curled and browned, but unmistakably Emma's. He knelt and gently brushed away a fallen leaf. The wind tugged at the edges of his uniform, but he remained still. Slowly, he took the paper from his pocket and unfolded it. It was a letter he had written the night before, not a grand speech, not a report, just thoughts from a friend to another who never came back. Hey Danny, it began, I don't know if you can hear me. I don't even know if this matters. But I need to say it anyway. I kept my promise. I walked you home. Not through the side gate. Not rushed. Not hidden. I did it the way you deserved. And people saw it. Really saw it. They stopped, Danny. They stood still in the middle of their day and watched you go by. That little girl you always talked about. Emma. She brought a daisy. She made the whole airport go quiet with just a flower and a whisper. And your mom, she's stronger than I ever imagined. She thanked me for bringing you home, but I don't think she understands that you're the one who brought something home for all of us. Things are different now. People are talking about honor again. About dignity. About what it means to carry someone, really carry them. And I've been asked to speak at some ceremony next month. They want me to tell them what it meant. But the truth is, I don't have the words. You'd be better at it. You always were. I just walked. You're the reason they stopped. Anyway, I guess I just wanted you to know you're not forgotten. You're not just a name on a plaque or a flag in a shadow box. You're the pause in a busy place. You're the daisy on the grave. You're the reason people are remembering what it means to stop for something sacred. And me? I'm still here. Still walking. Just not alone anymore. He finished reading, folded the letter again, and slid it beneath a small stone at the edge of the marker. Then he stood, brushing dust from his trousers, and looked out over the quiet field. He didn't cry. He didn't have to. The stillness in his chest was not grief anymore, it was peace. Earned, not given. Shared, not buried. On his way back toward the entrance, Sam passed a group of students on a field trip. Their teacher was explaining the significance of the tomb, of sacrifice, of silence. One of the boys looked up at Sam and whispered to his friend, "I think that's the guy from the airport video." Sam caught the words, met the boy's eyes, and offered a small nod. The boy straightened immediately, offering a salute that was more heart than form. Sam returned it with quiet pride. Outside the gates, Maggie Walsh was waiting by a bench. Emma sat beside her, kicking her legs gently, a new daisy in her hand. When she saw Sam, she beamed and ran toward him. "I brought another flower," she announced, holding it up. Sam knelt and accepted it as if it were a medal. "It's perfect," he said. "Just like the first one." Maggie rose and joined them. "We thought maybe today was a good day to visit." "It was," Sam said. "It still is." They walked together for a while, along the tree-lined sidewalk that led toward the parking lot, their pace unhurried, the conversation light. Emma talked about school. Maggie spoke of letters she'd received from other Gold Star families. And Sam listened, not as a soldier now, but as a man reclaiming his place among the living. As they neared the cars, Maggie turned to him. "You know, there's going to be a dedication at the airport next week. Permanent exhibit. Photos. Letters. The daisy. They're calling it, The Day We Stood Still." Sam smiled. "Fitting. They want you to speak." He looked at her, then at Emma, who was busy spinning in circles with her arms outstretched like wings. "I'll be there," he said. "But I think the real story already spoke for itself." Then they said their goodbyes, promises to meet again soon, and Sam watched as they drove off, the sun glinting against the windshield, the little girl waving from the back seat with her daisy pressed to the glass. Sam stood in the parking lot for a long moment, letting the breeze touch his face, and then turned to make the long walk back. Not to the grave. Not to the guard. But forward. The day of the dedication dawned bright and unseasonably warm for early November. The skies above Washington, D.C. were a crisp, unbroken blue, the kind that made the city feel like a photograph, still, composed, reverent. At the airport, a quiet buzz settled in like a gentle hum beneath the usual chaos. But this morning, things were different. Lines moved slower. Announcements were spoken with softer tones. Security agents took extra care. And at Gate A9, the center of so much attention in recent days, a crowd had already begun to form. They weren't tourists. They weren't influencers or reporters hoping for a viral moment. These were veterans. Families. Airport staff. Students in clean uniforms. Gold Star mothers wearing their sons' medals around their necks. And they had all gathered not for spectacle, but for something far rarer, gratitude in its purest form. The new memorial display had been finished the night before. A tall glass case stood beside the wide airport window, enclosing the now famous photograph, Emma's original Daisy, carefully preserved, and several letters handwritten by travelers who had witnessed the moment firsthand. Above it all, a simple phrase arched across the top of the case: "We stood still." A low wooden stage had been assembled nearby. Nothing grand. No curtains or spotlights. Just a microphone and a few folding chairs for speakers. When Sam Harper arrived, dressed once more in his full Tomb Guard uniform, the crowd naturally parted to let him through. There was no applause. No cheering. Just silence. Respectful, immediate, almost sacred. It was as though everyone had instinctively remembered what it felt like that day when they'd watched him walk with the casket draped in the flag, how time had slowed, how the air itself had seemed to bow. Maggie and Emma stood near the front. Maggie held a small envelope in her hand. Emma clutched a fresh daisy and waved excitedly when she saw Sam. He gave her a gentle nod, his face softening before returning to its soldier's stillness. The airport director approached, greeted him with a handshake firm and measured, and then stepped back to the podium to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this isn't a ceremony about an airport. It's about what happens when ordinary people stop and recognize something extraordinary. A moment of honor. A pause for sacrifice. And today, we honor not only Staff Sergeant Daniel Walsh, but also the man who walked with him. A man who refused to let silence be replaced by efficiency." The director gestured to Sam, who stepped forward slowly. His movements were precise, practiced, but his breath caught slightly as he reached the mic. He had prepared nothing on paper. He hadn't rehearsed in front of a mirror. Everything he needed to say was already alive inside him. "When I carried Danny that day," Sam began, his voice low but firm, "I wasn't expecting anyone to notice. In fact, I expected people to keep walking. To look down at their phones. To focus on making their flights. I thought I'd be walking through noise. But what I found instead, was silence." He paused, scanning the crowd, his eyes resting briefly on Maggie, then Emma. "I found stillness. Reverence. Strangers with their hands over their hearts. Children whispering questions. Mothers crying quietly. And in that stillness, something happened. Something I think this country has been craving: recognition. Not for me. Not even for Danny. But for the truth that there are moments too sacred to rush past." Sam exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the words settle before continuing. "Danny and I served together. We fought together. We laughed together. He was more than a fellow soldier. He was a brother. And he saved my life more than once. I made him a promise, to bring him home with honor. But none of you knew that. You didn't need to. And still, you stood." He looked out over the sea of faces, each of them caught in stillness again, just like that day. "You proved that we still remember what matters. You reminded me that the soul of this country still beats strong beneath the noise. You gave me something I wasn't expecting: hope." He turned slightly toward the memorial display, now shimmering in the morning light. "This isn't just a tribute to one soldier. It's a message. That we, as a people, are still capable of stopping long enough to see each other. To honor each other. To carry each other home." Sam stepped back from the microphone. There was no applause. No one moved. For a full 10 seconds, silence reigned, complete and unbroken. And then, slowly, one by one, people began to place their hands over their hearts. Veterans raised their hands in solemn salute. Children mimicked the gesture with clumsy sincerity. Emma stepped forward, guided by Maggie, and laid her daisy at the base of the memorial. Then she turned, walked back to Sam, and handed him something, a small, folded paper. He opened it. It was a drawing. Two figures walking side by side under a sky of stars. One tall. One smaller. Both carrying the American flag. And beneath it, scrawled in thick purple crayon, the words, "You kept your promise." I saw it. Sam crouched beside her and whispered, "So did I, sweetheart." Afterward, people didn't rush to leave. They lingered, talking in hushed tones, shaking hands, sharing stories. Some cried. Some laughed. A group of veterans in wheelchairs formed a quiet circle, trading war stories and tears. Rosa Garcia, the employee who first defied orders to honor Sam's walk, stood nearby passing out small paper flags to children. Darnell Boone stood at the edge of the security line, saluting each service member who passed. Sam remained at the memorial until the crowd finally began to thin. He stood alone for a while, watching the sunlight play against the glass, the reflection of the daisy forever frozen in time. He thought about how far one man's dignity could reach. How a single act, done in silence, done in faith, could ripple outward into lives he'd never meet. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice behind him. It was the airport director again. "There's one last thing," he said. "We're renaming this concourse." Sam raised an eyebrow. "What to?" The director smiled. "Harper Hall." Sam blinked. For a long moment, he said nothing. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," the director replied. "That's why it's deserved." Sam nodded once, turned back toward the corridor, and began walking. Not with a casket. Not with burden. But with peace. His footsteps steady. His posture tall. And somewhere in the airport's quiet hum, a rhythm emerged again, the rhythm of honor. Of memory. Of a country that had remembered, if only for a moment, what it meant to truly stand still. And as he disappeared down the long hall, Emma's drawing still clutched in his hand, it was clear to everyone watching that they hadn't just witnessed a ceremony. They'd witnessed a legacy. And it walked forward with every step Sam Harper took. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?